All right, the first fallacy I want to talk about, which has come bubbling up, is the undefinability of race. You've probably all encountered this point, or alleged point. There are no human races. Talk of race is not scientifically sensible. We should not talk about it. No such thing as human races. Now, this is what we philosophers call a verbal dispute. It's a dispute about a word. And of course, disputes about words get nowhere. You could say that's why philosophy has gotten nowhere in 2,500 years, because it's all about words. But in any case, what is the best response when people say that there's no such thing as race? Well, I think there are two responses. One is the one I adopt in my book, the one that Phil Rushton adopts in his book, and I think that serious anthropologists adopt. And that is simply to say that race is defined by place of ancestry. As far as current anthropologists are concerned, the currently popular theory is the human race, modern man, began in Africa, branched off into Europe about 100,000 or more years ago, branched off into Northeast Asia about 40,000 years after that. So you can simply define a Negroid as someone whose ancestors came from Africa between 40 and 4,000 generations ago. I say 40 generations ago because there has been some interbreeding in historic times. A Caucasoid is simply someone whose ancestors came from Europe, period. And an Asian is simply someone whose ancestors came from Northern Asia. That's what is meant by race, period. Now, the big objection to that is that there has been intermixing of these groups. There has been some interbreeding. Another objection is that there is no one gene which one group has exclusively and no members of any other group have. Now, these charges themselves are, you might say, put too high a demand on the definition of race. It's not required that there be a single gene, a single chemical that all descendants of Africans have and no descendants of Europeans have to be a different race. But I now think, on balance, that whenever this issue comes up, here's what should be done. We should give up the word race. Give it to them. Give it to our opponents. Say, you're absolutely right, race is meaningless. This is the only thing that works in a verbal debate. What we should say is, there are no such things as races. There are people whose ancestors came from Africa. There are people whose ancestors came from Europe. There are people whose ancestors came from Asia. Call them what you want. Call them Ned, Charlie, and Ralph. Call them A, B, and C, red, blue, and green. The question then becomes, are there genetic differences between these three groups, whatever you call them? You don't want to call them races, don't call them races. Nothing is lost but a word. They will feel very happy because the other side likes words. It's very important that they have certain words. I know this sounds disturbing. To want to give up a word as crucial as race, but I think in a verbal dispute, it's the only thing you can do. So that's what I advise. Worst comes to worst in debate, don't talk about race at all. Say that there are heritable differences between people whose ancestors came from Europe, people whose ancestors came from Africa. Don't call them races, don't call them anything, but that fact won't go away, and that's the fact to concentrate on. And when people talk about affirmative action, they say, okay, they're not racial preferences, they're preferences for people whose ancestors came from Africa, and so on. You just translate all the way down the line, get rid of the word, reformulate the debate in terms of the underlying facts that the debate rests on.